Delighted to be joined today by Laura O'Callaghan. Laura is the head of talent acquisition for the UK at Wise, the company that helps more than 12 million people send money internationally. Prior to Wise, Laura was the head of talent at Spendesk, and before that, spent more than 5 years at Meta in the UK as a recruiting lead on their product design and research teams. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Paddy. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. To dive right in, I'd love to take a journey down memory lane and ask you about your most memorable hire that you've ever made in your career.
Absolutely. So I guess the most memorable hire for me, and probably one of the most important, was my first hire in Meta. So I guess context is that it was my first, true internal role. And the calibration was a lot, or the ramp, it was a lot bigger than I anticipated. But I think for me, this hire was the point where I said, okay, I think I know what I'm doing here. So I was responsible for hiring into user research in Europe. And at that point, we very heavily relied on our North American interviewers and kind of senior leadership level. But the hire was a lady called Babette, who was actually a Dutch researcher who was based in Amsterdam. So it was a big kind of process in terms of relocation. But I guess the thing that stood out for me as a recruiter with Babette, I guess, is her communication was so succinct and so on point from the very first conversation that we had. It was super open and transparent. And I was very clear coming off that call what were her drivers, I guess, outside of the actual core role to understand why she wanted to join Meta. I think for me as well, she brought a lot of personality to the conversation. And that for me was so important, particularly as somebody new to the organization, to be able to really show the depth of understanding of the individual. And then the other piece is she was quite strong around her negotiation on what her non-negotiables were. And I think that for me stood out. And I felt confident coming into a possible cross-functional environment that she would be strong enough to say that this is what I think, and these are the reasons why I think it. And I'd say the biggest piece for me as a recruiter was the communication. I really, in most cases, knew where I stood with her, and vice versa, allowed for me to communicate more effectively, knowing that we had that kind of level of relationship. And as I said, that meant for me, I knew what I was looking for. I was the first hire, and I said, okay, I feel confident now. What does research mean at Meta? And we still maintained a relationship. I remember her coming over with her family and her partner at the time for a weekend just to really see what would life look like in London. And I went out for lunch with them. And that's not always the case, but I think for me, that was like a testament to the relationship that we built and the genuine kind of friendship. And to this day, she just had her first baby and she sent me photos on LinkedIn.
That's
so yeah.
Amazing. What a lovely story. That's great. I guess how did she get on? How did she get on at Meta in London?
Amazingly well. I'm very proud to say, and I take little responsibility. She actually relocated back to have her first child, but she progressed into being a lead or a manager. We say lead in Wise, but a manager in Meta, and actually relocated temporarily back in remote. I guess did her role remotely through COVID, but absolutely, I think the research directors would take her back in a heartbeat.
Love that.
So no, I was very proud.
That's awesome. And then thinking back over the many hires that you've been involved in your experience, what's the difference between a good hire and a great one?
Yeah, great question. It's a question I ask our team quite a lot. What's the difference between good and great when it comes to candidates? I think there's, of course, a lot of great candidates and a lot of great hires. But I think for me, the piece is very much around those individuals that know what they're looking for from the very offset of a conversation. And I think the pieces where it differentiates is somebody who is not only possessing like the technical skill set, but really the deep understanding of the cultural link between what they're looking for in their next company. Again, sounds very basic, but I think a great candidate is somebody who's actually spent that time to understand like how that particular role operates within the company. And somebody who's actually spent time to like prepare questions. Often you'd be surprised, I'm sure, Patty, similarly to you, there's sometimes people won't have questions. And I think it sometimes will come across as a flag to me that somebody wouldn't have like a deeper question than what you discussed on a call. Then the other piece is like somebody who's willing to be adaptable, because I think a lot of the times in the conversations that we have in big companies is that you may apply for one role. After the first conversation, you may in fact be more suited, or they perceive you to be more suited for a different role. And being able to demonstrate that level of openness and kind of flexibility and adaptability, for me, gives confidence that you probably be, very successful in an organization. And that's one of the key things that we look for in Wise here in our technical roles, is somebody who is adaptable and can build that strong relationships so that they know, if they need to change, why they need to change.
Super interesting. So there's a bit around there about curiosity. There's a little bit there about the deliberateness of the candidate, and then that flexibility. How do you get a signal on those things, both on paper like when you see an application, but also when you speak to a candidate? What are the signals that you're looking for? What is it that kind of gives you confidence around those things?
Great question. What I would look for to kind of, I guess, to signal adaptability from a CV is the broad nature and the breadth of the experience that they have within their role. And it's not going to work for every company, but if you think about a lot of cross-functional teams, you will wear many hats. So I think that's something that I would look for in a CV. But as we know, CVs don't tell the full story. So I guess on a recruiter screen or speaking initially to a candidate, what I would look for is examples of times that they've worked outside of their core role, I guess. And what kind of things that they have kind of done that would not be considered within their kind of scope. The other piece that I also ask is like, talk me through a time when you've had to like pivot in direction and talk me through how you went through that process. And that shows the level of adaptability and whether in fact somebody would thrive in an environment where, this is our direction. And then in a couple of weeks, we change the direction. And then it's also, I always ask questions around, tell me about a time that or what's the best work-related criticism that you've had and why do you think, or what did you do, I guess, to address that? And for me, that shows a level of adaptability and self-awareness to say, oh, I got X piece of feedback. This is what I did in order to change or to adapt and improve on that feedback.
Interesting. How do you, if you think about that last question, particularly around the reflection piece, sometimes candidates really struggle with that question because they think, if I tell them a piece of feedback that, was not positive, the interviewer is going to think poorly of me. How would you coach a candidate that was worried about answering that question? Or how would you kind of encourage them to give the best possible answer to that?
Yeah, I guess in order to kind of like alleviate any concerns or wondering why we're asking the question, I would always start with an example of my own and a situation where I've been given similar feedback. And then also preface the question with, the objective is not to find out whether you're good or strong or weak at a particular thing. It's how did you adapt in an environment where you're given feedback? And hopefully that puts people a little bit at ease. I think it's being able to be a bit more personal about it is very important. And then it comes across as less kind of like textbook, because that's not the intention. It's just to really understand how people thrive and what kind of, I guess, environments that they like operating in.
I always try to say to candidates, it's like, it's not about the story, it's about kind of how you handled it. And
Absolutely.
I think it's often more of a flag when say, tell me about some feedback that you've received, and a candidate's like, oh, I've never received any.
Yeah.
It's like, it's either you are, the only person in the world that's never received feedback, or, you're not telling. That's a harder thing to deal with as an interviewer.
Absolutely. And I think for me anyway, as a recruiter, like the environments that you do really well in are those that you're given that constant feedback. And to your point, if people aren't used to or comfortable in that kind of an environment, that is a huge transition.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't think we'd be setting them up for success.
Absolutely. Thinking back at your time, Spendesk, Wise, Meta, some fantastic companies there. What's been the most challenging role that you've ever recruited, and why was it so difficult?
So the most challenging, but equally rewarding role, I guess, for me was when I was in Meta. And I've never hired this type of profile since. But essentially, we were hiring what we called a futurist. Essentially, it was somebody that would come in at a strategic level, sit within the product organization, but essentially work with our research team internally, but equally external researchers to understand product 10 years down the line. So where do we foresee our AI products being in 10 years' time? It was an amazing role, so interesting. And I guess what made it difficult, there was a couple of things. I guess we didn't know what a futurist meant really. We thought we did, but we have spent time cross-functionally to really understand, both in our North American team, but our European team. Okay, what is this person going to do and why are we asking this person to do it? Then the second piece was the market mapping. It took us so much time to really understand, like, okay, we think it's a futurist. What kind of job architecture or job titles do those people have in different companies? And then we also had to like level set on kind of what the expectations within that role were. These roles typically sat in consultancies, and that's not the typical profile that we would have hired from Meta. It was very much about the end-to-end owning a product, when in fact we had to really adapt and say, okay, this person may come from a consultancy, therefore he or she may have been in different clients and not seen the end-to-end kind of product piece. Fortunately, we ended up hiring the person, but I think the key challenges internally was like that internal alignment. And that's what I say to recruiters when they join. It's so important to have that calibration of understanding across all of these interviewers and key decision makers. Do we really know what we're looking for? Do we feel confident if we find the right individuals that we're all on the same page? And that took a lot of time to really calibrate. And it took a couple of interviews, I guess, and conversations with candidates to really determine what it is we're looking for. But it was so interesting. Outside of the work that that individual was doing, it was so, so interesting.
That sounds fascinating. I've never heard of that job title ever before. How do you get alignment around something as kind of, I guess, hard to pin down and hard to define as that? Like, how did you actually get everybody on the same page? What's the kind of process that you follow to build alignment when there's a lot of ambiguity around a role?
Yeah, of course. So how I structured it to really understand, firstly for myself, but equally for the cross-functional team, and was really spend time with the hiring lead to understand the why. Like, why are we looking to hire this person and what will he or she do? Because that allows me to ground myself in why we're doing what we're doing. The second piece was to have that really close calibration conversation very early on. And as basic as it may sound, it was like having that weekly check-in with all of those key decision makers to understand, are we on track? Has something changed within the business? Because it was somebody was going to come in and do this long term. It wasn't a 3-4 year role. So having that like really close calibration and also sharing insights. That's the biggest thing, because not everybody knew what we were looking for. Not everybody was 100% confident. So me being able to bring those qualitative insights on what's happening in the market, this is what like groups of people are telling us. This is the kind of quantitative data that I'm seeing that in fact we actually may need to hire outside of London because in fact the talent doesn't sit here. And then we had debriefs. I'm very passionate. Anybody whose team I've been part of will say that, debriefs to really understand if this person isn't right, why are they not? Because that helps every recruiter to really tailor a search. I think that can often be a missing piece, be it an environment where you're hiring multiple of the same role, because that feeds into the I guess, talent of the future. But also if it's a niche role, we have to have that conversation.
Are those debriefs like a meeting after a process? Are they async? Like, what's your top tips for someone thinking about introducing that to their recruiting process?
So important for a couple of different reasons. I would say it's interviewer calibration. So many teams are growing now, and we need to feel confident, particularly if you're a global company, that what we're hiring for here in engineering in London is the same as in Brazil, etc. So it's an opportunity also for leadership to see, like, is there pockets of the business where we don't have people as calibrated as we would like, and therefore may not be making the right hiring decisions. And on the flip side for that, it's the same for a recruiting team. We're all scaling and talent acquisition is growing across so many different companies. It's important that recruiters know what they're looking for and why a candidate's not right. And then lastly, but arguably the most important, when we're thinking about the future talent, like if we don't sit down in be it a sync or in a Zoom or in person to discuss why an individual was not right now, how can we confidently say in 6 to 9 months that we can re-engage because we've actually taken the time to really see why would he or she be right, or what kind of skills gap would they have? And then the candidate feedback piece, being able to actually give feedback to a candidate is so important, particularly if you get to like, I guess, a latter stage of a process. What I encourage all of the team to do is as soon as you get to a final, that you have a debrief booked for 2 to 3 days after that. So you're giving your interviewers time to have, calibrate on their feedback, take time to write down what their thoughts are, and then you bring everybody into a room and it's really structured. It also allows for you to call out like biases that you may see in written feedback, which is so, so important. And the key piece that I always say is you should have somebody independent as a debrief lead. So somebody who's not been part of meeting this candidate, because that removes bias, but it also allows us to kind of like step away from the core hiring and see.
A person usually be in the talent team, or would that person be in the business, or how would you kind of do that normally?
So generally we would have somebody in the talent team who would be, I guess, a facilitator, for want of a better word, but then a debrief lead would be somebody within the, I guess, engineering community, typically at a leadership level. So he or she can kind of look within the team and identify if there's, a bias creeping in, or in fact, if we're not calibrated correctly, but somebody who's just not part of it, but is close enough to the craft that they can dig in, and if they don't get signal in a certain area.
Well, sometimes hires don't work out. Happens to everybody. When that's happened in your career, what have been the patterns? What have been the early warning signs? Have there been any kind of modes of failure that you've observed?
I guess, yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer, I guess, because there's no one kind of like group of characteristics that would indicate that the person wasn't necessarily successful. I think the ability to adapt, and I think you as a recruiter see that quite often in a process. You invariably have built the strongest relationship from a business perspective with this individual. And I think the ability to adapt is sometimes a signal for me. Changes throughout the interviews, questions maybe not being asked that were pre-agreed, if you will. And so I think in a adaptability, an ability to adapt. I think also one of the things that I've seen, not in all hires that haven't been successful, that that keenness to move too fast. One of the things I always say to people when they join, take time to understand why we do what we do, because that's invariably going to be part of your success here. And I think sometimes, and it can be for a variety of different reasons, it can be people that are just really keen to get into the craft, but invariably that typically cannot align as well within a company. So we're really encouraged, even in my time in Spendesk, I had an amazing CPO who said, take time to understand we hired you because we know you know what good looks like in talent acquisition, but seek to understand first. And that's what will set you up for success.
It's really interesting. We spoke to somebody recently who sort of said, look, their best hires are people that have made an immediate impact. How would you square those two things? Because I've seen both bits of advice given, and I think they're both right. But I guess in your mind, how do you think about that? Because I think people often do hear that, right? Some say, don't do anything in the first few months, just go on a listening tour. And then some other companies say, look, you need to get an early win, in the first few days. How do you think about that? What's good advice in there? What's the nuance between the two sets of ideas?
Very good question. I think it's very role specific and level specific. I think we think about it at a more senior level. Typically, the expectation is that you have impact within reason relatively quickly because you're brought in typically as an SME for your particular craft or leadership. What I always say to people is spend at least the first 2 weeks to really seek to understand what's happening within an organization, because it's great to make impact, but then retrospectively, the impact may be not as strong as you would have thought. So I think it's a balance. It's a fine line. It's also dependent on the business need, because one of the things, you may have is, if you think about recruiting, we may have an area in the business that, we would like somebody to come in and just instantly hire engineering. But then you also think about somebody who's going to come in and say, have a different lens and say, we would like for this person to take a bit of time, understand process with a view to hiring, and then changing process. So it's very hire person specific, I would say. But I think at the very least, if you're at a company size that you have an onboarding element to your role, I think it's important that you take that seriously. And that's what I say to the people when they join Wise is enjoy the first 10 days, because it'll set you up for the success or for your success in your role to understand what we do as a company.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I think about that, the sort of the juxtaposition of those two bits of advice. And what I think nobody means is, hey, come in and on day one, you should take the most recent project, completely reorientate it and then launch it, right? I don't think anybody means that. And I think sometimes it's useful to be really concrete. In your first couple of weeks, a great early impact might be that you've spoken to everybody on the team, that you've heard them out, that you've maybe given them some input from some of your experience, but you've understood them. And I think a really good sign for me with a new hire that comes in is that, the immediate team around me come to me and say, oh, wow, Laura's fantastic. Or, really got me to think about this problem I haven't thought about in that way. It doesn't necessarily mean they've all of a sudden gone and tried to, internationalize the business and open an office in Kenya or something. Right? Sometimes it can be as simple as just, speaking to everybody and understanding.
Yeah. And it's often a flag if it's the latter, somebody who's I've seen it in situations where people are trying to have too much impact too quickly and it just doesn't land. And I think particularly in talent acquisition, it's about credibility. And I think for me, credibility comes with delivery. So it's take it slowly. Things will happen in a more strategic level once you build that credibility within the teams. And I guess you could probably think of that for most roles, really.
100%. What advice would you give to somebody applying for a role at Wise today?
Do your research. Again, sounds very basic, but I think sometimes, and we're very fortunate to have a great brand, but people jump in to interviews with very little preparation. And I say that not just about the company, but equally, what is it you're looking for in your role? I think both of us in talent acquisition, we often hear where people actually get an offer and then in fact realize that an internal opportunity may have materialized had they had that conversation with their existing employer earlier on. So I would say that. So yeah, do your research in general, negotiate. I think it's really important to understand what are your core needs within a particular role. And I'm very passionate about negotiation. I think it's so important. I think candidates, irrespective of your function, should know your worth. And I definitely think it's worth spending that time to really understand what it is that would be most important to you. And it's becoming clearer as the tech industry evolves. It's not just about compensation. It's, flexible working. It's about do you offer sabbaticals, which is something we do here in Wise, and it's often a key piece to why people move and join companies. So I think that's a big key piece: research and negotiation, and I guess research and preparation as well is super important for me, and seeking to understand the culture, because I think that's a common misconception in companies that we all operate the same. And I think that was my key learning moving from Deloitte, where I was with an RPO, into Meta, because we had lots of people from Deloitte reaching out to me saying, hey, I'd love to work in Meta, or Facebook at the time. And I was like, I think it's important. And I was educating them on, the difference in the culture. Like, it's a lot more chaotic, which is for a lot of people, but equally it's not for other people. So like really understanding like what does it actually mean in practice to work in a company, and understand the core values. I think that's one thing that Wise really holds true to every hire we make. It's really like, does he or she know what the actual core values are here? And why would that make them want to work here outside of the craft?
That's super interesting. There's a couple of points in there I just want to dive in on. On the first point around like the preparation, coming into the process prepared and, understanding what they want to know out of it. We're seeing a lot of candidates now using a lot of like AI tools to sort of spam out applications, and often those applications may be fine-tuned by some kind of bot to make it look like they're appropriate for the role, or they might be kind of maybe creative in their use of those tools to kind of suggest, I guess, like, what do you think about those kinds of advances? What do you think about those kinds of tools in the process? Do you think they're helping candidates? Do you think they're potentially hindering them? How do you feel about them in your role?
It's a really good question, because prior to joining Wise, I actually went to an event in Robert Walters in London with LinkedIn, and they were talking about the impact of AI on talent acquisition in a broad sense. I think we do see it a bit. I think as a company, we're quite aware of it. And more so when I think about the engineering piece, like when we invite candidates to sit on a pair programming or a systems design, there's a level of awareness around if this person may be using a tool to enhance their performance and stuff like that. I think, look, it can work in certain areas, but I think nothing takes away from the actual face-to-face and the interaction that you have with a person. And that's why we're very pro having in-person interviews. I think one thing we've seen here at Wise is we've seen a massive increase in direct applications as a result of AI. And I think it's AI, but equally when we think about LinkedIn, their functionality, the easy apply, which they've now since removed, the easy apply application. I think it can go both ways, but I think nothing takes away from that kind of like human interaction and that creativity that
It's an interesting one. There are people out there that are looking at it and saying, well, it's a numbers game, so therefore I'm going to spray and pray. But I think the challenge is that if you spray and pray and you get something, then what? Theoretically, this is where you're going to go and spend most of your waking hours. Do you want that to be a deliberate choice of somewhere that's a great fit for you, or do you want to just shoot out 1,500 applications and see what happens? Is that how you want to spend your working hours? And so
I know.
I think it's an interesting choice, and I guess one that we'll see how it evolves over the coming years, because it's not going anywhere just yet.
No, definitely not. And I think where I have very little experience, but definitely genuine interest, is like graduate and early careers hiring. I think that it may work well in an environment where, you're at that point in your career where I guess company is maybe less important. It's about maybe getting exposure in a particular discipline. And I remind myself of when I was applying for a job after university, it was, apply to all of the big four and the equivalent. And now when I think about it, would AI have probably helped marginally in that environment? Yes, perhaps. I think it perhaps will help, but I don't think the spray and pray approach is definitely not the right one, in my opinion anyway.
Yeah, I just weep for the people that have got to read them all.
I know.
The other point you made there, I think, is really, really crucial, and it's about negotiation. And I have both been involved in a number, numerous candidate negotiations, and it can be you can see that candidates often struggle with it, and they find it quite difficult. They find it quite challenging. Even in our personal experiences, it can be an uncomfortable conversation. What advice would you give to somebody that has received an offer? How would you kind of coach or advise them on how to approach a potential negotiation, or how to think about that process in the least?
Yeah, of course. So what I would probably do to coach them is bring them back to the basics, assuming I'm the recruiter. Bring them back to the basic kind of, or the original conversation you had as to the why they want to join. Because I think typically when you get to negotiation, it can be defaulted or assumed that it's just around the actual compensation piece. But it's taking a step back and understanding like why this individual wanted to join a particular company in the first place. I think it's also one of the Meta did this really well was, about how we gathered compensation analysis. And I guess the key piece for me when I was speaking to candidates is like I would ask, say, for his or her salary very early on. But I always caveated that it's not because we're going to offer you at a similar or kind of marginally higher level, but it's for us to understand, are we competitive? That's one piece of it. But equally, we were very clear on like internal parity, and we felt confident that if you were on X, that we knew that our band was Y and that you would be offered that irrespective of what you were on. So they're the kind of conversations I would have had. But I think it's understanding as well from a market perspective where you're at and what you should expect. Because typically we saw as well when we were relocating a lot of people, their expectations were lower and very different to what we would actually in theory offer. So somebody who'd done that research and take that time, like I would much prefer a candidate to say to me, you deliver an offer on a Thursday, let's have a catch-up call on Monday, because I want them to take time to understand and make an informed decision. And it also is twofold when it comes to like competing offers. Or, you know, I think we've all had it, as a recruiter where a candidate says, hey, I actually have an offer from another company, so I'm going to withdraw from the final stage. I would always say, and be very human about it, it's take the time to make an informed decision. It's not, my intention is not to put pressure, but at least let's sit in a situation in a couple of days where you have two offers and then you can assess side by side. So I think there's that piece. And I guess when I think about negotiation, it always stood out to me. We used to hire quite a lot of people from Deliveroo in our design org, broad design, into Meta. And the female designers in the broad sense were incredible negotiators. I don't know what it was, whether they had some internal workshop, but it was really, really great because they knew what their worth was. They knew what they deserved, and they were very clear and structured in what was important to them and what their expectations were. And it always stood out to me.
Have to get to the bottom of that and find out how and why. I mean, that's fantastic to hear. I mean, it's a sad truth from my experience that the female candidates typically negotiate less than men. I think there are lots of studies that kind of suggest this, and I'd say that I've, anecdotally that's consistent with the experience I've had. I've always tried to say to every candidate, like, be really confident you're making the right decision. As I said earlier, this is one of the most important decisions you can make with your life. The quality of your life will be really informed by the quality of where you work and how happy you are about it. And so, we want people to enjoy their lives and have a good time at work, and compensation is a really big part of it. The worst thing that can happen is somebody joins and immediately feels like, they haven't got what they need or they haven't got what they wanted. It's a very, very bad place to start. So I do think it's key.
And that's why I really...
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's why I really enjoy working with our reward teams and have in previous companies. It's so interesting, and I think it's so key that the reward team have like a really direct or very strong relationship with talent acquisition, because you can gather data, but like there's how many people and candidates do we lose at the top of the funnel, and without having that connection to the talent acquisition team, they may not know. So yeah, something I'm very passionate about.
Super interesting. Last two questions from me. First one here is, what do you wish hiring managers knew about talent acquisition?
That it's very relationship driven. I think sometimes when you're in hyper growth, there is an assumption that it's conversations or kind of engagements with candidates are transactional, which it's for most part it's not. I've been very lucky to work with teams that don't operate like that. So it is like we're seeking to like build relationships both with them and the candidate. I think I would also give advice around like seeking to understand what we do versus making assumptions. Because I think sometimes, and maybe it's the nature of how talent acquisition has evolved over time, there's an assumption that we do roles conduct our roles in a certain way. So I think seek to understand, always say that to everybody that I work with, assume good intent and seek to understand. Because until you understand, you're just going to make an assumption. So I think there's that piece. And it's the reiteration of like, we're all here, particularly if you're internal, for the same reason. We want to hire great people. I remember once being asked, in fact, whether our talent acquisition team, not in Wise, whether in fact we were paid on commission, which is obviously not the case when you're internal. But I was like, no, for me, it's important that this person joins for the right reasons, firstly, and that he or she is happy within the role, because that for me is a sign of I've done a good job. And it's also about internal credibility as well. We don't want to hire the wrong people. So I think there's that piece. And yeah, as I said, the common goal. So yeah.
And what do you wish candidates knew about either the process or the role or what we do?
That things take time. And I think having recently been interviewing in companies, probably this time last year, I think I can see the candidate side of it. But equally, generally, when we have an update, we will give you an update. But then equally on the flip side, I would say, and I got this advice from my dad many years ago, was that it's like giving no update or giving an update to say there's no update is better than no update. If that makes sense. So I think a good recruiter will, if he or she had said, hey, Patty, I'll speak to you on Friday at 3, should have an update, pick up the phone, send an email, send that note, just so that he or she knows that, you know, you either don't have an update and that you're aware of the commitment that you've made to them. I think that's really, really important. And I guess similarly, seek to understand the role that we have as recruiters. You know, often very embedded in the teams, and we have a huge amount of insight. Again, it goes back to the point, I think sometimes there can be a perception that it's a transactional. He or she may not know what actually a product manager does or an engineer does, when in fact, often these recruiters and great recruiters are embedded in the teams very heavily, which is so important.
Absolutely. Awesome. Laura, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic insight. Thank you very much for your time today. We'd love to have you back in due course. But yeah, thanks again.
Thank you so much, Patty, and have a nice weekend.